Okay, well, it looks like I'm on my own today, just teaching to the cloud, and that's fine. We will be using a fair amount of a few resources today to learn things we need to learn. Those lights don't really help any, do they? It's not bright enough. Oh well, whatever. Anyway, we're going to start off today just taking a look at a few things that are in the book. And, hope you're seeing this. I hope this gets recorded properly. If it doesn't, I'll have to start all over again. But we started going through chapter 2 and started talking about what it takes to be an engineer and so on and so forth, what engineers are. There was this one particular chart that I wasn't able to show last time because the dock camera was not connecting. It turns out that the dock camera just got unplugged and I didn't see it. So we got that fixed. Let's hear it for technology. See if I can get this lined up right here. That's about right. So this chart is a really, it's a pretty good chart actually for some engineering topics discussion. It kind of shows the evolution of engineering through the ages. If you go all the way back to 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago, they start with civil engineering, where civil engineering is kind of the it's kind of the engineering of building buildings and infrastructure and plumbing and things like this. Electricity nowadays, it covers the electricity in buildings as well. But it covers roads and bridges and other things like this. But I would argue that before civil engineering ever came along as a thing for the human race, mechanical engineering came along. I think that the building of tools is mechanical engineering. The building of tools started a long time ago. And so that one goes way before. And even materials engineering and agricultural engineering, and believe it or not, even biochemical engineering that's way down here. I think all of those fields happened long before we think they did. And for example, the first biochemical engineering, genetic engineering really, that started happening with the human race, started happening when the human race started choosing who they wanted to propagate the species with by the size of the person, or by whoever won a big fight, two cavemen fighting it out, or two cave women even fighting it out. That is actually a kind of genetic engineering. It's not so intentional as it is maybe survival instinct, but it still is a type of genetic engineering. And it wasn't very long after human beings began hunting and gathering, gathering food and hunting food, that they started to realize that certain types of food, if they gathered them in certain ways, would be more plentiful the next time they came to gather them. That was true of bees and honey. It was true of many different kinds of seeds and nuts that they would gather. It was also even true of the kinds of animals that they killed. They realized early on that if they killed the weakest and the slowest animals in a herd, that the herd would be very healthy the next year, and also the hunting would be easier. And so they started doing those kinds of things, and those kinds of things were actually genetic engineering. They just didn't realize it at the time. And then not much later after that, people started only picking when they would pick their crops that they were growing, because they started growing crops before too long, that if they set aside all of the best seeds from the crop and only ate the lower end of the seeds, that the best seeds would make the better crop the next year. And they developed more. It's really quite incredible how far back the principles of engineering and different kinds of engineering go in the human race. And so, with that, we're going to watch a slideshow about engineering and the history of engineering here. Let me bring it up here really quick. This was not created by me, created by somebody else. I hate making like presentations in PowerPoint and stuff. A lot of people do. I'm not fond of doing it. It's time consuming, but there are a lot of people that love it and do it very well. And so when I find one that somebody else has done, I'll usually steal it, pilfer it, and use it in my classes. And this is one of those. This one is called Engineering History, and we're going to watch this together. So let's see if I can get this into the right mode here. Nope, that's not it. I forget how this works with Windows. Here we go. That's it. Full size, full page. As good as it gets, I suppose. Okay. So this is a brief history of engineering, and they're starting off here with one of the obvious ones, the building of the pyramids. You've got these big stones rolling around on the beams down here, and the slaves and everything else. That's so obvious, it's just kind of pathetic. But that's not actually where we're going with this presentation. So with this presentation, we start off with this chart about the evolution of man from ape through Cro-Magnon man and other things, and then actual mankind building simple rudimentary tools and weapons and asserting themselves on this world. This is where engineering began. Engineering was part of the process of evolution. In fact, without the engineering of things like tools, mankind could not have evolved the way that they did, because nature chose them because they were able to survive in harsh conditions, in difficult situations. Nature chose mankind because they could move, they could walk, they could climb, and they could leave an area very quickly, and they could go around or over any obstacle. There is no obstacle on this earth that man cannot go over, around, or under, or something. And that is not true of other animals. Even things like birds struggle to get across things like oceans, where mankind figured out a way because of their brain. And that brain came about because when human beings were still evolving, they were trying to come up with ways to do things, and when they did, that person that did it was smarter than the people around them, and they survived better. And then the next generation was smarter and smarter and smarter. They kept doing smarter and smarter things, and the smartest people always survived. And truthfully, the same thing is going on today. When somebody says the nerds rule the world, they're not kidding. Their nerds not only rule the world, but the nerds are the ones who survive the best and propagate their DNA through the human race. And humans just keep getting smarter. We revere all these athletes and all these people that do these amazing, crazy things on whatever they do with. But those people do not tend to propagate the species very well. Athletes don't tend to propagate the species very well, mostly because they're not kind of the settle down type, and they also have a tendency to be ruining their bodies, and they have a tendency to die young. And they're spending a lot of time doing their sport and whatever else they do, and so they're not spending a lot of time working at a job, having a normal life, and raising a family. And raising families is what propagates the species. It's what takes our DNA to the next generation. And people who do not do that, and frankly, there are a lot of people that just don't believe in that. I'm not going to have kids because I don't believe that we should have more kids on this earth that can't support them. Well, that's a bunch of baloney in a lot of ways. This earth it's been proven that this earth, proven theoretically, that this earth can hold hundreds of billions of people, not just a few billion, hundreds of billions, and not really feel the effects that much. And also, the people that say that are they're self-defeating. Their so-called smartness is not going to be passed down to the next generation. They're going to be eliminated from the gene pool. And then, thank goodness, because we don't need people who don't think well. This is engineering. Evolution is engineering at its most basic core. It is the development of things to better mankind. And mankind himself is bettered by this very process. So, why do we want to study history? The history of engineering. Any kind of history. Really, it's so we don't make the same stupid mistakes, right? We're not to be so easily fooled as our parents. This is one of the reasons that we really would like people to take U.S. history, so that we don't make the same stupid mistakes again and again and again. Unfortunately, it's not working all that well. We still make the same stupid mistakes, but we still try to not make those same mistakes. So, here are some kind of key things that we're going to try to do here. We want to see the progress we've made. We want to look at innovations that can help us later on. We want to avoid repeating mistakes that were made, so we're going to look at some of those. We're going to see where we're going so that we can know where we're been, right? Well, other way around. We want to know where we've been so we can see where we're going, right? But that is essential. To know what you can do, you have to know what's been done. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. You don't want to waste time doing something that's already been done. So if you're trying to move things forward, you have to know what's been done. Otherwise, you'll end up repeating things. Okay? So engineering builds upon itself as a very similar concept to that. Ideas that they had then, now we have more technology to create it right this time. This has happened again and again and again, that people have come up with an idea, but the technology just wasn't there. We weren't capable of doing it. That was true when the idea of lasers came about. It was scientists back in the early 20th century that came up with the idea of lasers. But it took a while to get that idea coming about. The idea of atomic clocks and atomic optics and using atoms to do very, very specific things, that idea has been around for 100 years, but it's not until the past few decades that it's actually come to pass. And the result is things like GPS and other amazing things that we take for granted today. So lots of ideas, and we're having ideas right now for things in the future. These ideas even come in strange places like TV shows. Probably Star Trek being the most famous among them, for TV shows that have had great ideas that came to pass by engineers saying, hey, we could do that now. The idea of the self-opening door, the doors that you see at the supermarket or at the school or whatever else. You see them all the time nowadays, where you have these self-opening doors that detect somebody that's coming near them, and they open them themselves. Well, that was an idea that was created in Star Trek in the 1950s, 1960s, whatever Star Trek, I think it was the 50s, but anyway. The first Star Trek movie had this door that opened itself. Now, in the first Star Trek, not movie, it's the first Star Trek TV show. That door in the TV show didn't open itself. There was actually a stagehand who was behind the door with a lever pulling the door open for people. And then they made a special sound every time it opened, this little hissing sound. But engineers watched that show. Engineers love Star Trek usually, and even the new ones. And they watched that show and they thought, hey, we could make that happen. And it wasn't even 10, 15, 20 years later that the first automatic opening doors were being put into places like stores and supermarkets and other places where it's really nice to have these self-opening doors. But nowadays in engineering, in science fiction films and other kinds of films, they're coming up with ideas that are exciting today's engineers. So even Hollywood can contribute to this, not just the engineering and science fields. So what's the earliest thing you can think of when it comes to engineering? Well, most people will think of something like the wheel, fire, cup, a bridge, clothing, hunting tools, shelter home, boat, dams, roads, whatever. There's all kinds of things you can think of when it comes to engineering innovation or invention. I would probably guess that the earliest engineering invention of note, and it would be hard to say because this was certainly prehistoric. Certainly this happened before we were taking records of any kind. But I would say it was probably something like a hammer, or, I mean, a cup is a good one. A cup is a really good one because you can create a cup with your hands, and that would be an innovation. Just cupping your hands together to scoop up some water, or to scoop up a beetle or something that you're going to eat. Gross. Or something like that. But I would guess either a hammer made probably from a rock or a stick or a bone or something similar, or a cup, or one that's maybe not so obvious, possibly communication, language of some kind. It probably was not a spoken language, and it probably was not any kind of written language. It was probably more of a gestural language, where you point at things, or you have a gesture that means something. You know, you beat on your chest, that means me, or give to me, or mine, or you beat on your chest and it means I'm powerful, whatever. Probably one of these kind of ape-like movements that are still used by apes to communicate was probably one of the first, earliest, really significant innovations that helped us to evolve into a smarter, more capable being. Here's a great invention that not many people know about, and very few people have, even fewer people have ever seen. It's called the atlatl, and probably it was invented around 10,000 BC. The atlatl is this little stick here at the end of this spear, right here. Hopefully you can see that it's on the right-hand side of the spear, and it's this person is holding on to it with their hand. They're holding on to the end of the atlatl. And it was essentially kind of a stick with a little notch in the end that the spear would fit into, so that you could extend your throwing lever with your arm. It's like making your arm a little bit longer. And it would allow you to throw the spear a lot faster and a lot harder, a lot farther. Now, I have actually seen these things, modern ones. There is a man in Utah at the college I used to teach at, which is now a university, actually. And he would make these things and make long spears and atlatls, and then he would teach kids and teach adults to throw spears using atlatls. And he was very good at it. In fact, he was so good at it that he actually hunted elk with one of these things, and actually was able to bag an elk using an atlatl on a spear. These things were used to attack mammoths, as far as we can tell from the fossil record. So they were useful. You could actually take down a large game animal with these things. Elk are big enough, but a mammoth was like 10 times the size. And this is again why I say that mechanical engineering probably predates civil engineering by a great amount. Well, about 10,000 BC also, we started to see the domestication of wild plants. So there is a plant, or there was a plant, there still is a plant technically, called teosinte, right here. And it's essentially a wild grain plant, kind of like a weed. And it has these little seed pods in it that look kind of like wheat pods. But over the years, as people were trying to eat this, they would take the biggest ones and the best ones, and they would save them for planting the next year. And over the years, over and over again, they'd take the biggest ones, and eventually, the plant that they were growing and the plant that they were harvesting and eating was this plant that had corn on it, which of course we still eat today. You can see that they have kind of some similarities, but you wouldn't really be able to tell that they're actually related unless you looked at a fossil record, look at some fossil records, some archaeological records, but also if you looked at the DNA record. If you look at the DNA of these two plants, you can actually track how they are kind of related, how they could have evolved, how the corn evolved from this teosinte. I'm not even sure that's how you say that word teosinte, but I'm just guessing. Here are some other examples of domestication with not just plants but also animals. If you've ever seen a zebra, they're really quite small, not well suited for riding, not well suited for doing work. But the horse is certainly related to the zebra. And the horse is the domesticated version. If you've ever seen a ram in the mountains, a mountain ram or a mountain sheep, sometimes called mountain goats, they are not all that great for wool or eating. They don't have nearly as much wool as a domesticated sheep. And the meat, there's not really as much meat, and the meat is not as good. Also, not as much milk. If you're into sheep's milk, I love sheep's milk, especially for the cheese. But the domesticated sheep has all of those things, and they also won't run away from you. Like zebras and wild sheep or mountain sheep, man, they will. If you try to chase a mountain sheep around the mountains, they're going to stay a mountain ahead of you. They are so fast and they can climb anything. They're amazing. Down here you have the goat and the mountain goat, similar to the mountain sheep, but not exactly the same. Here you have the moose versus the elk or the deer, right? So this particular one is a reindeer. Reindeer are a specific breed of deer that is used to do work and used for food, specifically in northern Europe. We don't use them a lot here in the Americas, but they still are used. You have the water buffalo and the cow. You have, and then down here at the bottom, you have the oak tree and the almond, which are related. So the oak tree and the almond tree. Of course, the oak tree gives an acorn, which is not really edible at all. And the almond gives an almond, which is extremely edible and quite tasty, actually. Why do I have an advertisement? That's weird. Oh, is that the book for this? Oh, yes, this is the book that talks about these things. So, notice on this map the ancient civilizations that are all the oldest civilizations of all time. They're all right here in the middle of the tropical regions, because that is where human beings could survive at those times. That's where it was warm enough, that's where everything grew all the time. There was plenty of rain, plenty of soil for growing things and everything else. The problem with these regions is that not all of these regions had everything else that man needed to really excel at things. They didn't have all the minerals for mining to make ores and metals. Some of them did, some of them didn't. And so as human beings became more capable and more mobile, they started moving north and south. For the most part, they moved north because there's more land in the north of Europe and Asia. There's more land in the north of America, right? So mostly they started moving up to northern places and started looking at resources that they could use, right? And so even though we still have a lot of people in the tropical regions of the world, we now have a lot bigger populations than we used to in the northern and the southern regions outside of the tropics. And that is because of engineering, essentially. Here they talk a little bit more about these. I'm not going to go into them too much, except to talk about the tools that were developed then. The plow, right? This is a fairly complex plow that you're seeing here. It's got lots of parts and even some moving parts pulled by animals. But originally, the first plow was like just a stick that you just scratched up the earth with, or a bone, or a rock, right? And then eventually they said, if we got a bigger rock, and we pulled it along with more people, and then they said, well, if we got a bunch of sharp rocks and tied them all together in a line, and then and then stood on it and had somebody pull. I mean, they just kind of immediately would find something new and better and try to implement it, which is essentially what engineers do. There was a need to plant food so that they could eat, and engineers met that need. The yoke for oxen was a big invention, where you could tie two animals together and effectively have them pull as one. And it's still used today. It's been around for thousands of years, almost 10,000 years. Still around today. The loom. Of course, when people started moving north and south from the tropics, things started getting colder in the winter and hotter in the summer. Okay, the north and the south, the northern and southern regions are colder in the wintertime and hotter in the summertime than the tropics. The tropics pretty much stay about the same temperature all the time. They're all about 80 degrees. So they needed some clothing for the wintertime, and they needed something to block the sun in the summertime. So they needed clothing again. And animal skins are terrible for that, really terrible for that. Besides that, you can't kill enough animals if you start having more and more people around. And when you start having better and better food around, the better food makes more people and bigger people, and animal skins just won't cut it. You won't have enough of them. So they started creating clothing from plant fibers and from animal fibers and from other things. Of course, metal played a huge role as they started to use metal. Now, here is one particular invention we hear a lot about, the wheel. All right, don't reinvent the wheel. Well, how was the wheel invented? Many, many people were building big buildings out of stone, and they needed to be able to move them. So what they'd do is they'd put a log on the ground, and they'd lean the stone on top of it, and then they'd push it along. And as the stone got all the way along the edge of the log would roll towards the back of the stone. And then they would put another roller on it and roll it some more, and then they put another roller. It was like making a road out of logs that the stone could roll on. And eventually they said, why don't we just take the logs with us instead of, or maybe they were in an area where there were lots of snow and ice. And they said, let's just have this thing that's underneath the stone all the time that has curved edges front and back, and it'll be pretty easy to pull along, and it was. They call that the sledge or the sled. And then they said, let's put the sled on the roller, because that way the sled has these round things on the front and back, and that is easy to deal with, but it's also rolling along from log to log to log as we put the logs down. And then as they did that, they noticed that you would get these ruts in the log. And they also realized that it was helpful, because then the sled wouldn't slide around side to side. And they said, well, let's just take it one more step. Let's just connect that sled to that log so that it doesn't go anywhere. And now we have wheels, a wheeled cart. Right? And then it just was made that way on purpose. It wasn't very long before, when you have these civilizations being born and you have things being invented and things being built all over the place, it wasn't very long that some smart people came along and said, we need to have rules for how we do these things, so that when houses are built, they're not falling apart. So that when we build a bridge across a river, it doesn't fall into water. We need to have somebody who is smart and somebody who knows what they're doing, somebody who has experience, going around and checking to make sure these things are good so that our society can be strong. And the first one of these that is known is the Code of Hammurabi Construction. Right? Hammurabi Construction. And essentially had these 4 points. If you build a house for a man, you don't make the construction firm, and the house causes the collapse and death of the owner of the house, the builder shall be put to death. So in other words, if you're building things for other people, if they're trading their coconuts to you to build their house or whatever, and you build their house and it falls apart, you're in trouble. You're to blame for that. And if you cause the death of one of the sons of the owner of the house, then the builder, their son, will be put to death for that. And if you cause the death of a slave, then you'll have to give a slave of equal value. If you destroy property, you shall restore what's been destroyed and rebuild the house which collapsed at their own expense. Now, there are similar rules to this for engineers today. Of course, putting them to death isn't so much the issue anymore. They're not that strict. But still, if you're an engineer and you cause problems, you cause death, you cause accidents, injuries, loss of property, you are going to be responsible for that as an engineer. The ziggurats, the Tower of Babel, civil engineering, right? Tower of Babel, of course, is the famed tower that was built to try to get to heaven in the Bible. But there were many of these, and the biggest one that is known today that is still standing is outside of Mexico and kind of looks like this guy. It's what we call a terraced pyramid, where you have these terraces or these steps, this stepped pyramid. And it is the biggest pyramid on the earth today down in Mexico. I think it's in Mexico. It's just an amazing structure. It's amazing that it can be so big. It's not just a pile of rocks. I mean, there are rooms inside this thing. All kinds of really interesting things going on inside of this thing. So, civil engineering, pretty advanced even thousands of years ago. Ancient Egypt, of course, is very famous for its canal systems because it has this huge river, the Nile, going through it, and they needed all that water to grow crops. And so they built these canals, essentially fake rivers. But they're also even more famous for their pyramids. Even though their pyramids aren't the biggest, they're probably the most famous. One of the things that the Egyptians were famous for was building the stepped pyramids and then putting a facade on them that made them look more geometrical, than like we see here, where they look like a true pyramid. They're very famous for that. Other things that they were able to develop great new things for as engineers were surveying tools. They actually were able to figure out how to make perfect 90-degree angles. And they were able to figure out where things should be and to build them exactly the place where you wanted to build it, which is much harder than you think. If you want to build something that's 500 feet from another location in the west direction, for example, that's a much harder thing to do, even with today's equipment, than you think it is. Even engineers today can be off by hundreds of feet just because they make one little mistake or they're just not understanding something properly. But the Egyptians learned it, figured out how to do it, and they applied it very well. Getting the materials that they needed was important. Getting stone out of the mountain requires very specific tools and skills and techniques. And those were all developed by these early engineering type people. Moving the materials, of course, we already talked about that with the cart and the log and everything else. And then here's one that we don't think of sometimes, workforce logistics. How do we manage the workers? How do we find the workers? How do we train the workers? How do we keep the workers happy and strong and skilled? Very important part of engineering. We go to Greece and we see that they did very similar things. But they, in addition to what the Egyptians did, they built some of the best seafaring ships of the time, some of the first. So they were able to build boats that had lots of oars and even sails on them. They also were able to figure out a way to moor these ships or to park these ships. Very important as well. And of course, one of the reasons is because they had a lot of islands. Greece had a lot of islands at the time. Of course, when we start using metal, we start doing all kinds of things, including using metal in buildings and tools and everything else. There are lots of things that were changed when metal started coming into play. Of course, metal has been used for a very, very long time, but it hasn't been used in the way that we would call metallurgy. For example, thousands of years ago, you could find lead in certain places, and you could pick it up and you could melt it down and use it for things. You could find tin and you could find a little bit of iron ore, but iron was harder to mess with, so they just didn't. But it wasn't until they started to make fires really, really hot and to control the fires and to understand how heating and cooling in different ways can affect the metal. So they were developing this engineering, this type of engineering that's led to blacksmithing and other kinds of metalsmithing. It wasn't until they started to understand that through experience and through practice and experiment that they were able to make things like steel, which were really useful, or cast iron, or things that are very, very strong, very hard, very whatever. So this really was a big deal. Here's a great invention, the lighthouse, right? The first lighthouse in the world, ancient Greece. Tunnels filled with water, in fact. You could bring water from a long distance and even bring it underneath mountains like they did here. They actually dug a tunnel into the mountain to bring water, fresh water, to a city that didn't have it. Weapons. Weapons are always a big deal when it comes to engineering, and many, 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 many engineers today included work on weapons. Back in the day, we're talking about bows and arrows, crossbows, new kinds of spears, new kinds of other things, catapults, trebuchets, all kinds of tools for wreaking havoc and destruction on your neighbors, right? Still very popular use of engineering today. But a more useful thing, water pumps, right? The first water pump, 250 BC, invented by Archimedes, who, by the way, also invented the catapult. But they're still using the same exact model today, which is the screw pump. They're still using the same thing in sewage treatment plants. You can see now where Rome reached to. Before you had just these civilizations down in southern Spain, in Italy, Italy and the Mesopotamian area over here in Greece, what is Greece today, and other countries. And then you had some stuff in the Middle East here, when you had ancient cultures. But now people are moving north. They're moving north up towards northern Europe, towards Central Europe. They're moving away from those areas because they can. Here's the water wheel, where you can take advantage of water running in a river or water running through an aqueduct to do some work. Maybe it's to turn a big stone for grinding wheat, or maybe it's for cutting through rock. Right here, they're using it to cut through rock. And you can use that. You can use the energy that you get from turning a wheel, or the mechanical movement, in other words, to do all kinds of things. And then the building of roads, which the Romans really learned and perfected. We still use the Romans method today, where you have different layers of materials, and you have different types of materials. So down here you have big rocks and sand, and then you have smaller rocks on top, and then on top of the smaller rocks you put in these stones that sit on top, and you have walls on each end. And then you have drainage on each side. You have a ditch that's full of the soft material, dirt works, and it is the drainage so that it takes the water away from the road during the rain. And there are many Roman roads that are still in use today, and still, especially, in England they have plenty of them, lots of them. In France and Germany and other places, lots of them. Bridges and roads built by the Romans, and here's an example of that. Of course, as the Romans got better and better at things, they started to discover new techniques and new types of engineering. Architectural engineering and really advanced civil engineering with the arch. The Roman arch is based on a couple of different really important innovations. One of them, probably the most important of them, being this thing called the keystone. You have this stone that when it's put in place with all these other stones, it holds the whole arch up so that you can have huge arches to go underneath. Right? So these big arches on this aqueduct were designed to let both wind and boats through on the water, wind through the upper surface. But also, it makes this bridge a heck of a lot lighter than it normally would have been. These arches are very strong. And so this is a lot lighter than it would be if it was just built solid. Okay. So, other inventions that come along the way, the roller bearing, of course, is a big one among them because it allows us to essentially have very free-moving, rotating, rolling, sliding objects, all kinds of different things. So, here they're putting civil engineering very, very early again, but I would say you could put a lot of these engineerings very, very early. So here is an early invention of the bicycle called the velocipede, right? Instead of having pedals and a chain, it was just moved along by the movement of your feet. Didn't take on for a very long time, but it did do pretty well. 8 miles in less than an hour, that's not too bad. The machine gun, right? The Gatling gun was the first machine gun, and it wasn't very long before they stopped using it because it was very heavy, because it has, this particular one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 barrels on it, 7, 8, 9, 10 barrels on it. So it has 10 barrels on it, and the idea was that one person could shoot a lot of bullets at a time, right? Essentially, this thing would rotate and the bullets would be fired off every time one barrel rotated in, and you had a gun that was firing very, very quickly and a lot of bullets. But it was very, very heavy, and so they wanted something that was smaller, and so eventually they came up with a single barrel machine gun and killed people more efficiently, I guess. Not such a great thing, but that's just true. It's just what it is. And then, of course, the bicycle with pedals was invented later on, too. So, what do we want to get out of this history of engineering? What we really want to get out of this history of engineering is that engineering is part of the human experience. And that as engineers, we are trying to kind of squeeze all we can out of that human experience and improve mankind in the best ways and the fastest ways possible. We want the human race to really make that jump into the future. And that is my history of engineering. Now, in our book, again, they go through a lot of the fields of engineering. You'll need that for the homework. The functions of engineering, engineering as a profession, rather, engineering education. These are all things that we have talked about and we have discussed in different ways. The last thing that I want to talk about before we go on, there's a couple of things here that I want to just cover really quickly. Let's go to the book on page, looks like page 38. Professional societies. There are many professional societies for engineers. They have a list of them here on page 39. And many of these societies will allow engineering students to join for free. And I would recommend that if any of these societies interest you, that you go and find out how much it costs to join as a student. And if it's free, go ahead and join it. Or if it's cheap and you're willing to pay for it, go ahead and join it. Because you can get literature from them. They'll send you a magazine every month talking about their field of engineering. They'll send you jobs. They'll send you scholarship information. They'll send you all kinds of things. And it can be a really great opportunity for you to learn more about engineering. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention. The next thing is section 2.9 talks about the engineering design method. This is something we're going to be using in this class quite a bit. And so we need to talk about it really quick. We're going to use it later on in the class here, you can see in these, we're going to be doing design stuff. But the design method right here, similar to the scientific process, in that we're going to have some things that we're going to do and in pretty particular orders, but it's going to also be a cycle. So that when we get to certain parts of it, we're going to kind of loop back and do other parts of it. And we'll see other versions of this, but here on page 39, they say identify the problem, assemble a team, identify constraints, search for solutions, analyze potential solution, choose the best, document solution, communicate solution, construct the solution. This is one version of it. There are a lot of them that we're going to see, but know that this method is something that we're going to study a lot. We're not going to go into it too deeply here, but know that we will see that again. Then they go into some things that I'm not going to discuss in this class. And then at the end, we have traits of a successful engineer, creativity, and traits of a creative engineer. And those are the last three things that I want to discuss. The traits of a successful engineer, they list them off. Let's just read them. Interpersonal skills, the ability to communicate with people. Okay? That's important. Communication skills, reading, writing, talking. Okay? Important. Leadership. You've got to know how to be a leader, and you have to know how to follow. Competence. You need to know the field of engineering. Logical thinking. Quantitative thinking. Okay, those are all about problem solving. You've got to be able to do it. Follow through. You've got to finish things. Continuing education. Maintaining a professional library. Having access to information, in other words. Dependability. Honesty. Absolutely essential. If you are not a naturally honest person, and you know you like to stretch the truth every once in a while or tell a fib, you better change that or just not go into engineering. Because if you get caught doing that, and you will get caught, if you get caught doing that as an engineer, you will be roasted alive. Organization. Okay? It doesn't mean that you have to be retentive in your organization. You don't have to alphabetize your breakfast cereals. But you should have some organizational skills. Common sense, which is not really all that common. Curiosity. Creativity. Creativity being one of the most important. Engineers are the most creative people in the human race, without a doubt. Creativity, they have a quote here from Einstein that says, imagination is more important than knowledge. I would have to agree with that. Okay? Creativity is something that engineers must have. It should be a natural part of themselves, but they also should develop it, and they should build on it in themselves. They should do things in their lives that promote this in their personalities, and they should also promote it in others. They should help others to be creative, and that should be something that they enjoy doing. So creativity is important. It doesn't mean that you have to be a painter or a flower arranger or something like this, but you should be creative, and you should want to be creative. And the traits of a creative engineer, what are they? Well, let's take a look. Stick-to-itiveness. This is on page 49. Sticking to it. Never giving up. Asking why. The asking the why and the asking the how. Those two questions are, if they're not naturally part of your personality, if you don't always ask why to your teachers, start doing it if you want to be an engineer. Why does that work? Why is it that way? How did that come to be? Don't just sit there and take notes. Ask why. Ask how. Creative engineers never satisfied. They always want to make it better. They always want to make it different, more interesting, simpler, whatever. They always want to improve it somehow. Okay? Doesn't mean that they don't stop at some point, but they always want to tweak something. They always want to see what the next thing could be. Okay? Learns from accidents, and you will have plenty of them. You will make mistakes, you'll have accidents, and you will be prone to being blindsided by the accidents of others. You need to learn by those things. You need to not get angry by them, and you need to not be frustrated by them, but to learn from them. They make analogies. Creative engineers are able to look at a situation and say, oh, this is kind of like this. This is kind of like playing soccer. This is kind of like baking a cake. This is kind of like another project that I'm doing. And then be able to use that analogy to solve a problem or to take the next step or to get around some obstacle. They generalize, okay? When an engineer is looking at something and they come across an important thing that is going to be a general rule that's going to apply to a lot of different things, they internalize that. So, for example, if I'm outside and I'm working on whatever I'm working on, and I drop a hammer and I see the hammer fall to the ground, right? And then I see that happen again, I can start to make a generalized statement that things that are dropped outside fall to the ground. And I can even generalize that to the inside, right? That happens a lot in engineering, where you notice something happening again and again in a very specific situation or in a set of circumstances. You say, I am seeing a general rule here, something that's I'm going to be able to apply in other places as well. They develop qualitative and quantitative understanding. They have good visualization skills. They can talk about something and then visualize it in their mind and make a drawing of it. The next thing is good drawing skills, good sketching skills. Learn to do that. Learn to draw, learn to sketch. They possess unbounded thinking. They have broad interests. They're not just interested in engineering and what they're doing at work. They have a broad interest base, so they do other things so that their mind can be open to other things. They collect obscure information. This is a weird one. But engineers tend to remember things that are kind of weird, that other people don't. They turn out to be important in many cases. Because working through problems in a logical way often requires you to have weird things in your head that you just remember because they're useful. They work with nature, not against it. Don't try to conquer nature with your engineering. Use nature to make your engineering better. And they keep an engineering toolbox. An engineering toolbox is full of all these things you've learned, all these things you've gained, and all the things that you can do to be an engineer. And that's what I have for you today.